Hello, honeys, and welcome back to the podcast. I've got a wonderful episode ahead of you today with a wonderful special guest. Everybody, meet my cohort member and good friend, Jacob Robertson. Say hi, Jacob.
Hi, everyone.
Go ahead and tell us a little about yourself.
So I went to ASU for both undergrad and graduate school. I got my undergraduate degree in art history. We were in the cohort together. It was a very small cohort.
Very small.
And we leaned on each other a lot in that cohort. We got very close over those 2 years. I actually ended up graduating a year after Celia.
But for good reason.
Yes, for a good reason.
A lot of study to do.
I did. I had to go to London to do my thesis, which was terrifying and exciting at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now we get to share the benefits.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Now, honeys, in order to be good scholars, we have to know what exactly the hell we're talking about. So here is some coverage, a basic intro to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. A basic overview to start. They were a secret society, air quotes around secret society, of young artists and one writer founded in London in 1848. They were explicitly formed in opposition to the Royal Academy's styles, especially their promotion of the Renaissance master Raphael, as well as being totally over genre painting, the popular thing at the time. The Brotherhood's style grew out of several principal developments tied to Romanticism in the early 19th century Britain. What I mean by that is that they were inspired in large part by the theories, actually, of writer John Ruskin, who lived 1819 to 1900, and who also urged artists to, quote, go into nature. So they tried, according to their own interpretation. Although the Pre-Raphaelites started with a lot of initially religious themes, they began to branch out into ones from literature and poetry as the Brotherhood went along through time, particularly those dealing with love and death. But they always used these established characters to explore modern social problems. And we'll have Jacob talk to you a little bit more about that later. For now, the thing to know is what made them different, especially visually. The Pre-Raphaelites did not idealize at all ever, but instead painted figures with unprecedented realism. They made people's physiognomy and character really stand out so that the model shined through the character they represented. They were true to the peculiarities of anybody's given faces, whether they had strong eyebrows or thin lips. For this reason, their works and approaches are sometimes considered sacrilegious or even blasphemous, and we'll get into a case study example of one of those in a minute. Nevertheless, as if this startling realism wasn't enough, the themes themselves were often daring on top of that. The Pre-Raphaelites were not afraid to include what would be considered problematic subjects at the time, such as poverty, immigration, prostitution, double standards of sexual morality in society. In fact, says one of our sources for today, quote, their pictures require a lot of concentrated reading and are so densely encoded with signs and symbols that you have to work hard at deciphering them, end quote. So the Pre-Raphaelites really emphasized individuals, they emphasized reality, and they emphasized thinker artworks, but they also used bright and often naturally vibrant colors so that their pictures demanded a viewer's eye more than other works in a given exhibition. Although we are going to be focusing on the sisterhood aspect of the Brotherhood later on in the episode, it is important to know who the leading figures here were, who faced the highest level of opposition from critics and society, included William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The second phase, which was right around 1860, after the Pre-Raphaelites had started to become highly influential, they were especially inspired by Rossetti's styles and works. He's considered to have made major contributions to symbolism. Millais's biggest role with the Pre-Raphaelites has to do with their later years, so we'll get to his impacts when we talk about the group's evolution. For now, though, let's note our context for a minute. Mid-19th century England. This is a time in which revolutions are sweeping across continental Europe. There's an uprising going on at home in Britain for social reform known as Chartism. The Pre-Raphaelites are also working in a period of mass industrialization and social ills. So from the beginning, the Brotherhood aims to communicate, it's hard to find the right word, these hopes, this perceived opportunity of artistic renewal and moral reform by making their art very serious, very sincere, and truthful to nature. a touch of extra context because it's funny and interesting. They had some supporters as well as some critics of note, and one of their biggest haters actually was Charles Dickens. It is probably fortunate for the Pre-Raphaelites, however, that one of their important champions was Ruskin. He was a supporter of this painting from nature, a leading supporter of the Gothic revival in England. He was slow to warm up to them, but very loyal once he did. He particularly appreciated, admired the Pre-Raphaelites' impacts on English landscape painting, their working in plain air, their strict botanical accuracy, their dedication to the teeniest of details. And now, as quickly and yet informatively as I can, their evolution and how things eventually ended. As the 19th century progresses, we start getting into the 1850s. The Pre-Raphaelites are increasingly interested in decorative arts as well. So in 1857, in fact, Dante Gabriel Rossetti meets two young PRB followers at Oxford by the names of William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. They become major figureheads in the Pre-Raphaelites, I think it's third stage, but for now it's important to know that the latter goes on to become Rossetti's apprentice, and the mentor invites this pair to help him paint scenes from the life of King Arthur on the ceiling of Oxford University Union shortly after their meeting. While they're doing this, the three men decide upon and begin to promote an even more strictly medievalist strand of Pre-Raphaelism. They preach the virtues of a pre-industrial life. They modeled their paintings and furniture in the style of late medieval art. So we're seeing some different nuances happening in the Pre-Raphaelite movement as time goes on. And that decorative focus only grows. In fact, in 1861, Burne-Jones and Rossetti join Morris's new design firm of Morris, Marshall, Faulkner & Co. This company produces murals, stained glass, furniture, textiles, jewelry, wall coverings, and wallpapers inspired by botanical motifs, often based on medieval methods of handcraft, and with these illustrations drawn from what was at the time popular symbolist literature and poetry. This firm is historically notable, say our sources. In fact, quote, the firm responded to the rift between the fine and applied arts caused by the Industrial Revolution and mass production by reviving the workshop practices of medieval Europe, considered a paragon of spirituality and artistic integrity. By the mid-1880s, a movement to unify the arts, known as arts and crafts, took root in England and by the century's end was flourishing throughout the British Isles, end quote. So this company, as a result of being a Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood tangential effort, sharply changed the course of what everyday artwork looked like, literally everyday artwork, across the entirety of the UK. That's no small thing. Unfortunately, though, as all things do, it came to an end, and here is how the Brotherhood ended. Spoiler alert, it's Malay. His very own artwork led directly to the breakup of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and here's how. In 1850, he exhibits a new work, Christ in the House of His Parents, and it draws severe criticism, not only from Dickens, but from many other notables in the art and political worlds of its supposed blasphemy of the Virgin Mary. Although Malay modeled the figure on his own sister-in-law, critics found Mary ugly here. As Dickens says, Virgin Mary is a degenerate type, one who was horrible in her ugliness. They also believed it was wrong for the Holy Family to be depicted as poor. They thought these two things were very scandalous. Mary ought to be, in their opinion, idealized and beautiful. So the aftermath of this very poor reception is that some just straight up leave the movement then. James Collinson left the group, and Thomas Woolner moves to Australia in 1852. Generally, though, other members just did not exhibit together again publicly. They remained uncomfortable about this controversy for the next few years. That is until 1853, when Malay puts the final nail in the coffin by accepting membership to the Royal Academy, the very institution the PRB was challenging, so the group officially dissolves. And with all of that background information out of the way, here we go, honeys, our exploration of the sisterhood of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So, Jacob, tell us about your thesis, your findings, your surprises and or complications while you were researching.
So my thesis was on we could say that she was late second generation or third generation Pre-Raphaelite, on the late Pre-Raphaelite artist, Evelyn de Morgan. She was born in early 1850s, just a few years after the initial Brotherhood was formed. So she was very young. As the Pre-Raphaelites were already moving through sort of the second generation and into third generation, she was just coming to age of becoming an artist. Evelyn was born into a rather wealthy family, and so that caused some strife between her parents and her, career aspirations. She had a very famous uncle who was involved with the Pre-Raphaelites, John Rodham Spencer Stanhope. And so Evelyn's parents kind of saw her as following the same footsteps as him. And he was considered like a black sheep of their family.
Okay. So they saw him as leading her down the wrong path.
Yeah. Even though he was rather successful, not very publicly well known, but technically well known. He was involved with like Rossetti's workshop. He showed his own paintings in galleries. Yeah, so it was just a common fear of the upper class to have their child become a bohemian painter.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that's how she gets her introduction to the fine arts, is through this family member. Awesome. What does her career itself look like?
So she had a rather successful career. She was one of the first women students inducted or accepted into the Slade School of Art. She was...
Sorry, State School, that's UK or France for the list?
Slade School. SLADE.
I also needed the reminder, honeys, that's in Britain. Anyway, continue.
So she graduated from the Slade School of Art. She had a very successful career from the get-go. One of her first paintings was bought in, I think, like 1878. So she was very young when she sold her first official piece. Those are air quotes for people who cannot see that. But yeah, she had a really successful career. She married William de Morgan. So William de Morgan was a famous potter, ceramicist. He was associated with William Morris and the Morris & Co. sort of like arts and craft aesthetic movement, but he himself was a little removed from that. William was quite a few years older than Evelyn.
What is quite a few? How many?
20 years, 18 years, somewhere in there. Okay. But by all accounts, they had a very loving and very wholesome marriage. I'll get into this a little bit later, but they were very egalitarian in how they split up their sort of relationship and domestic duties. But because Evelyn was so successful, she was the primary breadwinner for the couple up until the last 10 years of William's death. Among being a ceramicist and artist and all that, he was also an author. He was not very successful until his very last book was published, and then that actually became a success. And that was only a couple years before he actually died. But yeah, she was the primary breadwinner. She showed at the Grosvenor Gallery, which was a sort of avant-garde, leading-edge gallery in London that was frequented by Burne-Jones, by other sort of second generation Pre-Raphaelite artists that were doing even more than what the initial Brotherhood did in terms of aesthetic or formal, even content. Honestly, de Morgan was an artist that I knew a little bit about before I started my thesis. I had seen some of her more popular paintings like The Love Potion or Flora, but I really don't know too much about her. I thought she was a beautiful painter. I loved her painting. I loved the thematic content. She was very interested in classical mythology and also medieval stories. But what specifically I find to be singular for her as an artist is her interest in spiritualism and her political activism that sort of served as the foundation for all of her art to a degree, especially in her later years.
Okay, so can you elaborate on both of those things a little further, please?
Yeah, so spiritualism as sort of a 101 about it was this sort of pseudo quasi-religious scientific movement that was born out of a bunch of 17th and 18th century philosophy, but essentially purported that the soul, upon your body's death, the soul would go through these cyclical evolutions until it achieved this state of total enlightenment. That's a very condensed version of it, but there's a lot of sort of social context for that. So Darwin's recent evolutionary theory that had just been published a couple decades before in 1919. And so spiritualism as a movement, as a concept, picked up in 1850. It actually started here in America, and then it migrated over to the UK.
I'm remembering a little bit about spiritualism as kind of the American Ouija board origins. Yep. From what I remember, also Harry Houdini hated the fuck out of spiritualism.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway.
Yeah, there was the sort of philosophical side, and then there was the practical economic side of hosting spirit parties where you'd have a spirit board and you would sort of connect with the spirits and ask them questions. And
Right.
usually it was performed by a medium that was receiving a nice sum of money. But yeah, it migrated over to the UK in the 50s and 60s. And then it still had that very sort of like spectacle quality. You'd host parties, but it also developed a very like serious following. And De Morgan, from a young age, had been interested in religion. She was obviously raised Christian, Anglican, but I think it didn't completely answer all the questions she had. And so spiritualism was a very interesting and
more complex, maybe.
Yeah, as well as being more scientific in a way, because it was integrating these very recent ideas of evolution, of matter and energy.
And then you said spiritualism and
her political activism.
So
she was a very loud proponent of many causes. She was a suffragist. She was a pacifist. I think I could even call her an anti-imperialist because she was really focused on, she abhorred violence. She thought violence and war were damaging to the soul, and that's how it plays into the spiritualist aspect, was that this war, the violence that was going on around the globe with, England's colonial wars and then later World War I, that these were damaging not just the body but the soul. And she was concerned about these peoples, not just the soldiers, but also the citizens that were affected by this.
Of course. And that only got more and more relevant as things went on, as you saw in World War I and then in World War II,
right.
More and more civilian communities being targeted.
Yeah.
So I could imagine that if that was something that already weighed on her conscience, that would be just nightmarish.
Yeah, World War I for her was really devastating, I think, emotionally. But also at the same time, it was also invigorating because in the last decade of her life, she produced some amazing paintings that are still that sort of like Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood-esque quality, but are also moving much more towards this like modernist idea of art and also this very like abstract, very occult even idea of spirituality and the souls.
Okay, so let me ask you something because I have been interested in since seeing, I didn't even realize it was a landmark exhibition at the time, but when the Guggenheim did that first on Helma af Klimt and her very spiritual, pre-surrealist work and how much it tied to her ideas about the afterlife, spirituality and all that. Do you see any parallels between her and De Morgan in their work, in their emphasis on spirituality, in their career experiences?
Definitely, yeah. I think what's interesting and maybe why people don't immediately connect De Morgan to maybe later spiritualists like Helma af Klimt is because De Morgan's work was still figural. She used bodies to represent her ideas, whereas Helma af Klimt was a little more geometric and abstract in her ideas, and she was maybe focusing on more like modernist formal elements. But I definitely think that they had some very similar, I mean, they were both self-proclaimed spiritualists, so that, first of all, that makes a connection. But I also think they had some very similar notions of like the soul as both an abstract idea and also as a concrete physical thing that underwent these changes that would progress through these like steps on a ladder or steps on a pyramid, like Klimt's famous, the pyramid.
Oh, yeah. So maybe not in what you can see, but the meaning behind it.
Yeah. The philosophical content that they were sort of expressing, that they were trying to either impart or teach to some degree to their audience, because De Morgan was very interested in didactic art, to teach, to morally instruct people as well.
So then, do you think her art was also a form of political activism throughout all of her career? Or do you think maybe that came a little later with some of the war stuff we were just talking about?
I definitely think it was in her art from the beginning.
Okay.
I think to varying degrees. Some of her earliest works are very traditional in their sort of neoclassical mythology, but I still think there was and not just simply by virtue of being a woman producing art, but I do think there was a political aspect to them.
Do you think maybe it was political in the sense that it went against the status quo of the, male breadwinner kind of norms?
I think that aspect, definitely. People knew she was successful. She was selling her art, so obviously there was an audience for it, and she was a breadwinner for her and William. I also think it was political content-wise because, when she went to the Slade School of Art, they had life drawing classes, but as a woman, she was not allowed to attend those. So everything she learned about the anatomy was through her own study of sculpture, of, friends and family. And so for her to produce, especially in her early career, these large pseudo life-size nude paintings of mythological people like Cadmus and Harmonia, which is a full nude female figure with a snake wrapped around her body. I think that in and of itself is political.
Spicy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and you think of like other paintings, like I think it was John Collier's Lilith, where she's in the meadow and the snakes wrapped around her. That would come, I think, another 10 or 20 years later.
Oh, it was that much later.
Yeah.
I didn't wow. Okay, so she set the standard. She
Yeah.
made the first little Eve moment there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, Eve had been depicted before, but obviously, like, that's what you think of when you see a naked woman and a snake. You go to Eve.
So that's interesting to see that come from her so very long ago in a not male gazy way.
Yeah.
Because that picture doesn't look very male gazy to me. It looks very much like, yeah, here I am, and what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Did she have any particular sponsors or patrons? Were there any standout supporters of her career in that way?
Interestingly, no. She did have regular, I guess you could say, patrons who commissioned her, but they didn't sponsor her as an artist like you would think, maybe like classical sponsoring sense. She was just a working artist who could sell her art. She knew she had an audience for it. There were sort of like well-to-do, like there was a shipyard owner who bought several of her pieces, but it wasn't like a normal sponsorship like you'd think for maybe like the more like 16th and 17th century artists. She was a worker. She produced the goods and people bought them, which I think is really fascinating, especially for that time frame.
Definitely, to see any woman's work valued, but especially a creative output. That's a really meaningful thing in that time, especially with the long history of women's artwork, especially when it falls into the quote unquote craft category, being overlooked. So that's cool. So clearly economically pretty successful, publicly recognized to a degree. What about the critical reception from the fine arts world? Did she have anyone who particularly disparaged her work, or was the Brotherhood and the larger art scene of London fairly into it?
So that's a really interesting question because critical response to her work kind of ran the gamut. She had critics who cast her off as a follower or imitator of the Brotherhood, specifically Edward Burne-Jones, because they did share a similar aesthetic style. They had, interests that were in the same sort of like medieval and classical scenes. So critics kind of disparaged her for that. There was a lot of thought that, she's technically a good artist for a woman. There was a lot of sort of the qualifications. Yes. As a woman artist, she did good because she was a woman. And so therefore she kind of be compared to the men artists because they were the real artists. But as far as female artists go, she was great. There are also people who genuinely liked her art. She was showing in the Grosvenor Gallery, which was a very sort of modern, cutting-edge gallery that was producing other artists that weren't just associated with the Pre-Raphaelites, but also associated with arts and crafts movement, with the sort of aestheticism movement, like Walter Crane, the illustrator, that was associated with, arts and crafts, and William Morris. You also had a very big women artist population in the gallery. So you had other artists that were associated with the Pre-Raphaelites that were women, like Marie Sportelli-Stillman, Kate Bunt, and other women artists that would be associated with like the so-called Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood.
So as we mentioned, you did go to London and you did a lot of hands-on research that I'm sad to say I didn't get the opportunity to do quite as much of. So tell us about that experience. What was it like being in the archives and handling some of these documents firsthand, seeing the works in person for the first time? Tell us about it.
So what's interesting about De Morgan is that her archives were quite literally a storage unit in a warehouse, an art warehouse. I sat on a library stool for 3 days in there. It was great. I'm not complaining about that, but it was not the glamorous Oxford Bodleian, glass cases that I thought it was going to be. So the reason for that is De Morgan's art is basically owned by a trust. The stuff that's owned in private hands, it's owned by this trust that's run by this lovely, lovely curator. She's the head of the De Morgan Foundation, Sarah Hardy. She helped me so much with my research. But it's really like a one-woman show plus the board of trustees.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a great time, but it was so interesting to sit in like this little storage unit going through stuff.
It sounds much more maybe intimate than you were expecting.
Yeah, like everything was right next to me on this cart. A lot of the paintings weren't there because they were traveling around the world, but there's one I got to see firsthand up close. It was Fair Rosamond or Queen Eleanor and Fair Rosamond, which was one of my favorites. So it just was very lucky that it was sitting on the shelf next to me. But yeah, the archival research was a lot of just looking through every single thing, trying to find out what was interesting. Because when I went to London, I knew what my thesis was broadly about, which was sort of not just creating like another critical body of work for de Morgan, who she has some stuff written about her, but not a lot, like even Elizabeth's at all. But it was also about, comparing her to the other women artists, what makes them all similar and what makes de Morgan stand out uniquely.
Right.
So I had that in mind, but I didn't know what I was looking for in the archives. Like,
right.
There were hairbrushes, there were paint palettes, there were receipts for I think postage stamps, anything and everything was saved in this archive. But an interesting aspect of de Morgan herself is that very few primary materials from her written by her exist. We have a couple letters. There's a journal from when she was a 15-year-old.
Oh.
And then that's it.
Wow.
We don't know what happened to it. We don't know if it's destroyed. We don't know if it's sitting a state house in north of England. We have no idea where it is, if it exists. We have a lot of letters to her from, her uncle, her family, her husband, associates, and friends, but there's nothing really from her, which is what makes researching de Morgan so interesting and so frustrating at times, because there were so many unanswered questions.
Sure. Yeah. It's got to be really difficult to piece together a person only based on the small bits you get from the people around them, especially if those bits don't match up.
Well, yeah, the only catalog raisonné that had been made by her was in 1996, made about her art. It's in 1996, and that was kind of the only piece of information besides articles and encyclopedic entries and her being mentioned in other authors' work. She really only had one book about her. And then there was the first time that her art was shown in the US was back in 2023, January 2023.
Really? That was recent.
Yeah, in Delaware. And there was a catalog made for that. So there were these two books and then a bunch of articles. And of course, there's a wealth of Pre-Raphaelite information, articles and literature and all that, but there's so little about her in what we think of when we do art history research.
So lots of data gaps for you to kind of fill yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think was one of your biggest misconceptions heading into this product? Something you really believed was true that you found out, no, it's slightly different.
So my thesis was specifically comparing de Morgan to Rossetti, at least in the aesthetic and formal sense. In my mind, they shared a lot of similarities. They had a lot of subject matter that overlapped. They even shared the same model of William Morris's wife, Jane Morris. William de Morgan and Evelyn de Morgan were really good friends with the Morrises, too.
Okay.
So in my mind, this connection existed that I had not seen anyone talk about. And if I am sort of doing this duty of uncovering what I can about de Morgan in a sort of quote unquote feminist sense, then why not compare her to Rossetti, who is the most contested figure in Pre-Raphaelite art history for good and bad reasons. And so I went in the archives expecting to find some sort of interaction between the two of them, some sort of interaction between the de Morgans and Rossetti, because they lived very close to each other in Chelsea and London. The archivist, Sarah, she said that, she basically was from here, and she pointed down the end of the hallway, that's where their houses were to each other in Chelsea. And there was no record of an interaction between them whatsoever. William de Morgan had interacted with him on his own, with Rossetti on his own, because William was well known. He was friends with William Morris, and William Morris was friends with Rossetti, and so they all were in the same circle. And so I have to assume that they met at some point prior to marrying Evelyn de Morgan, but it doesn't look like they ever interacted. And honestly, that's not surprising. And I don't think de Morgan was actually a big fan of Rossetti, at least personally. Especially because later in his life, Rossetti was reclusive. He was a little eccentric. He had health issues. He had the affair with Jane, the affair with Fanny after Elizabeth had already died. Lizzie died, I think 2 decades before.
Right.
So I think by that point in his life, he wasn't showing. He wasn't really producing art, at least publicly. So I think maybe she just had no interest in interacting with him. And she, in her mind, I think had better things to do. Because Rossetti was also a little bit selfish. He was a little male dandy in the parlor.
So you say dandy, and you mean fruity bohemian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He was eccentric.
Gotcha. So that is kind of fascinating, though. I guess you would expect there to be at least one point where they talk to each other on some sort of record. But as you said, many of those records were lost.
So that was really I had a moment of, oh my God, I have to change my thesis because they haven't interacted. Thankfully, I was able to work around that. And
yeah, clearly.
Yeah.
Clearly. Any other surprises, maybe an anecdote or anything that you hadn't heard before?
So when I was in London, I went to the De Morgan Foundation Archives, which is a warehouse in South London. I also went up to De Morgan's ancestral home in
Yeah, I forgot you'd done that. Yeah.
up in basically in York. Between seeing the show in Delaware earlier in 2023 and then her home up in north of England and the single art painting in archives, I saw every single painting that was in my thesis, which was fantastic and very lucky for me.
That is lucky.
But up at her family house up in it's been converted to a museum since. It was beautiful grounds. It was so pretty. It felt like I was in like Pride and Prejudice. It was amazing. But Anna Wintour, the Anna Wintour is related to the Spencer Stanhope family, a direct descendant of John Rodham Spencer, of Wilhelmina Spencer. That family is, I don't know how she's related, but she's related to them close enough that she had the archival Vogue collection on show there. So they had archival Alexander McQueen in the Victorian dining room on the table. Yeah.
That's really cool.
I walked in and I thought I was going to see De Morgan paintings, and instead I see, Alexander McQueen. John Paul Gaultier in the water closet. It was insane.
That would blow my mind a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously it was great I got to see the paintings, but I was like, oh, so I get, 2 shows in one right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about the Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood from your perspective. What was your overall impression walking away from all the research that you've done?
So the Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood was a term that was sort of applied retroactively. It was applied by scholars in the 80s that were sort of doing the work of second wave feminism to uncover women artists that were lost to the patriarchal art history. So the Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood was a sort of conglomeration of women artists that were associated with the Pre-Raphaelites. That could be their spouses, like Elizabeth Siddall, who was married to Dante Gabriel Rossetti. That could be siblings. That could be siblings like Christina Rossetti, who was Rossetti's sister. It could just be people who were trained by the initial Pre-Raphaelites or the second generation Pre-Raphaelites. So Marie Spartali Stillman. And like even non-painters like Julia Margaret Cameron, who was a photographer that was also very well known for her time. The other interesting aspect about the so-called Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood is that they weren't just artists, they were also models within a lot of the males' art.
Yeah, I can't remember what her name was, but the ginger lady, the model for Ophelia.
Yeah, that's Elizabeth Siddall, who John Millay painted that painting, but was, she was a working model as well as an artist, as well as, the wife of Rossetti. And that's what I find so fascinating about them, is that they weren't just one thing within this movement, that they were collaborating with the men, and the men weren't just using them as sort of like the divine inspiration, that they had a very collaborative, very working relationship.
So we have established De Morgan saw a fair amount of commercial and critical success. What about the other female painters and producers associated with the Pre-Raphaelites?
So yeah, there was Marie Spartali Stillman, who also showed at the Grosvenor Gallery. That's what my thesis specifically focused on, comparing De Morgan and Spartali Stillman, just because they existed at the same time. They knew each other, knew of each other, ran in similar social circles. But out of all of them, they all kind of, no one was singularly more successful than the other. There was no standouts like, Rossetti or Burne-Jones. You didn't have the Waterhouses or the Holman Hunt of the group. They all had success in their own way, but I think they also all had success because they were first and foremost working artists. Yeah. They were selling art. They were producing art. They were modeling for artists. Mm-hmm. They were working. They pursued their careers. Yes. Yeah. They treated it as a career, and it was a career for them, which I think is really fascinating. Yeah, definitely. Because you compare modeling in that context as one part of a greater whole to someone like the famous Madame Gautrove, Madame X, who was a socialite, and that was her one sort of foray into the art world. It makes a little more sense why the Pre-Raphaelite sisters, I'm just going to use that because it's easy. It's easy. Yeah. Why they might have had more success, might have had a little more liking, might not have gone down so infamously in the bad sense as Gautrove did. Well, and I think it's because that they were already working class, that it wasn't, to a degree, it wasn't crossing those social boundaries. It wasn't transgressive in the same way. It was transgressive for other reasons, but it wasn't that sort of stepping outside of your sphere in a way, which is also, I think, why, at least in de Morgan's earlier life, there was so much, allegedly, there was conflict about this between her parents and her because they were well-to-do. They had a family estate.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the sisterhood terminology came around with second wave feminism in the 80s, as you and I have discussed a number of times. Wonderful ideas, excellent movement, very important for its time, got us forward for sure. But we also have come in, especially recent years, to realize that the second wave of feminism was not without its faults. It definitely could have been more intersectional. So how do you think the nuances of that 80s feminism may have affected how we see this sisterhood?
Yeah, that's honestly what I was interested in exploring in my thesis, was not only representation of the sisterhood, but also the scholarship that surrounded the sisterhood that has shaped them into what we know today. So I think a lot of things could be said about 80s feminism, but the big thing is that they went out of, I feel like there's this movement to not just carve out a space for women, but to destroy everything that came before it as far as scholarship went. So there was like this sort of overcorrective idea of what the relationship between the men and the women in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the Pre-Raphaelite woman movement were.
Yeah, I got you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So there was this very, very famous article that came out in like 1985 and 1986 by Grisella Pollock and Deborah Cherry called Woman is Sign. And it was about Elizabeth Siddall's like sort of effacement within the movement, how they felt that Rossetti, as a sort of patriarchal artist, male figure within the movement, but also within just society, enacted his position, his male gaze upon the women artists in the movement, the women models in that movement. So Rossetti wasn't just a painter, he was also a poet. And so they look at both the painting and the poetry of Rossetti and sort of construct this idea. And it's not without its merits. I think there's a lot of things that they do bring to light. But this idea that Elizabeth Siddall as this figure, as this model, is only there to serve the genius of Rossetti. That she is a canvas for him to project his masculine genius onto. And she's there to just sit there and look pretty.
Yeah. So you think they actually maybe did women like de Morgan a disservice by unintentionally minimizing the work they actually did?
To a degree, yeah. The way I got into the Pre-Raphaelites was through this sort of like very retroactive revisionist idea of them. Mm-hmm. And as I had sort of begun my research, even before my thesis, just my general interest in them, I was kind of, not that they downplayed that their actual work they did, but they do it in such a binary way that it felt like that they were reenacting these sort of gender roles that they were purportedly like defending against.
Right. They fell into their own sort of trap.
Yeah.
Amazing how easy it is to do that. What, in your opinion, are the biggest misconceptions surrounding maybe not only the women of Pre-Raphaelite, but the movement as a whole?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe, so if someone just goes into a museum and looks at the Pre-Raphaelite art, they see it's very pretty. I mean, obviously it's gorgeous art. It's my favorite for a reason. But when you look at it, I think they kind of see it as just like telling a very like storybook story in a way. Like it's showing like knights and princesses and queens and, you know, these tragic heroines and these like, you know, very flowy gowns. And I think there's a lot of surface levelness to it that comes out at first, and that people don't understand maybe the subversion that's behind it in a lot of ways.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Could you give us any sort of example?
Yeah. So Malay's Mariana, she's standing at a window with her, you know, back towards us in this gorgeous blue gown. It's velvety. She's in like what looks to be like a church. She's staring out the window. She has her hands on her hips and she's just gazing out the window. You know, if you read the context card for it, it tells you what's going on. But if you just look at it, you just see, you know, it's technically very nice, but like what's actually happening? Like, why was this such like a critically derided painting and also publicly adored painting? And it's because he depicted this woman in this moment of like intense private solitude where she's tired of waiting for this guy to come back to her. It's based on Shakespeare's Tempest. She's tired of waiting in this house for this guy to come back to her. Her embroidery is left at the table behind her. There's leaves on it. So obviously so much time has passed. And she's in this very private, very, improper pose of slouching, her hands on her hips, her neck's thrown back. And it's this very, I think, relatable pose. But to look at it from a critical perspective, it's completely derided. They hated it because they thought it was improper to show it. There was no moral value behind it. And yet, according to, public perception, women loved the painting. They flocked to it. And so I think that says a lot about that specifically, but also what I at least find in the Pre-Raphaelite art is like this subversion using these like grand archetypes, these grand figures, these grand mythological narratives to show very real and very contemporary issues that were obviously well known.
Struck a nerve.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
How do you think we fight some of those misconceptions?
By
at least ease people's minds.
By getting me to yap. No, I think it is just a matter of exposure. When I remember taking a class and it was with my thesis advisor, Julie Codell, and she was talking about the avant-garde in the 19th century. And you, of course, have the Impressionists, but you also have the Pre-Raphaelites. And someone in class raised his hand and was like, what do you mean the Pre-Raphaelites being avant-garde? And I found that so interesting because in my mind, of course, they're avant-garde. They're cutting edge because they're doing what's not normal. They're doing something outside of the curve, just like the Impressionists were. But when you look at something like, The Lady of Shalott, you don't see how that is necessarily, and maybe Lady of Shalott's not a great example because at that point they were already in fashion.
Right.
But they were doing stuff that was outside the norm, and you don't know that until you're exposed to it, until you talk about it.
That's fair. Yeah, I suppose that's a perfect anecdote for you to tell because for the longest time, I also didn't really understand how they could be avant-garde when their entire thing is using elements of the past. But I guess it is that quote unquote good appropriation of putting intentional twists on things to make the viewer think a little bit.
Yeah.
I think maybe if I were to say that because we are no longer in the context of 18th or 19th century Britain, it's harder for us to see that in the Pre-Raphaelite. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's also when you look at again, the Impressionists are the great example to compare them to because they were both, modernist movements that were rising at the same time, but the Impressionists are visually different too. And that's what I think is easier to grasp for people. Yeah. Because formalism is sort of that's why we do art history. Yeah. But I think, it's hard to understand what a painting from 1878 about a medieval woman, what does that mean? Why is that important? But I think that's also where my personal interest in the 19th century comes out is because I think the 19th century was so, disruptive and was changing so rapidly. And so for a painting of a woman with red hair and a white gown to be so critically disruptive at the time, why was that a thing? Why was their society so fragile for that to be so disruptive to them?
Fragile is a really interesting word to use because we don't typically think about industrial revolution times as having a fragility, and yet they did because everything was changing. I imagine people themselves felt very unstable.
Right.
So it's good. It's a good term to use.
Yeah.
I think this is a really important kind of discussion to have about them being avant-garde and ties into a question sort of raised by the Tate that I came across in research for today's episode. The Tate is arguing they were the first modernists because this rule breaking with the Royal Academy, because they did draw up a manifesto, because they had interest and influence across various art forms, including more decorative stuff, and of course their inclusion of women. How do you feel about specifically the term modernists there? Do you think modernist is actually appropriate, or do you think it's more just kind of the broader umbrella of avant-garde?
I think modernist is appropriate.
Okay.
If you look at what people call the first modernist painting, Manet's Olympia.
True.
If you think about at least for art history, why that was important, a lot of those same elements I think are reflected in the Brotherhood's initial work and also the stuff that they inspired. The flattening scale of foreground and background, the use of color, the focus on not idealizing, but representing what they see, representing the real world. I think a lot of those ideas are found in both. And then also just thinking about specifically with de Morgan, when I look at her paintings, especially in the last decade of her career, there is this very much, I find her paintings, even though they look Pre-Raphaelite in a way. I find them to be much more in line with modernist paintings of the 20th century than I do with like Victorian sentimental portraits of, some famous person.
Sure.
Even though they're both figural, like her use of color, her content. I think the big thing about modernism is it was representing modernity. It was representing the changing world of their reality rather than looking backwards.
Yeah.
And so if you think about the Pre-Raphaelites in that sense, well, yeah, they were looking backwards, but they were still depicting
They were using
reality.
Yesterday's tools to show today's problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
You should be like an art historian or something.
Maybe I'll think about it. Maybe I'll go to grad school.
Again.
Oh my God. What are your thoughts on if the Pre-Raphaelites had originated in ever so slightly different contexts? Like say they sprung up in France instead of Britain. How might they look different? How do you think that change in location, that change in context might have affected some of their priorities, some of their ideals?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, okay, first off, I don't think the Pre-Raphaelites could have existed outside of Victorian England, specifically because they were constructed within this very specific reaction to the Royal Academy and to a very like British Victorian social society of repression, of emotional repression and physical repression. But if they were to, maybe have been like in France or something, I don't know. I think content-wise, they probably would have changed a lot because a lot of the Pre-Raphaelites' interest was in the classical and medieval. And obviously French art was interested in that too, but I think they would have been much more interested in maybe more recent history, like the French Revolution.
Good point.
Because England hadn't really had anything like that yet. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was, upsetting to the social fabric, but it wasn't an actual uprising.
True. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I wonder if maybe they would have reacted differently to that. I wonder if maybe they would have.
Do you think they could have ended up closer to the Impressionists maybe in some of their
like technique?
Yeah, plein air style.
Well, what's interesting is the second and third generation of Pre-Raphaelites used plein air style. Yeah, Waterhouse was famously, the Lady of Shalott is one of his biggest plein air pieces. So I wonder maybe it would have just been more of a formal similarity at that point with more brushstrokes. Honestly, even to some degree, I feel like de Morgan's late works have that sort of, obviously not impressionistic, but it's much less focused on technique than, the Royal Academy stuff was.
Gotcha.
But that's also really interesting to think about because when you think of like Impressionism, it's modern day. It's only showing modern life. And so I wonder how that would have looked with, medieval figures or maybe that was the reason that medieval figures were used is. Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe similar destinations, different journeys. So this one's actually going to be my last question. Can I ask, do you think that there are any other specific movements since the Pre-Raphaelites that really were inspired by them, really utilized their teachings, or any very significant parallels you see in movements going forward with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood?
I mean, there is stuff like symbolism, like French symbolism that was obviously like drawing from and parallel to it. But I also, and this might get me shot.
We love a controversial opinion.
Late surrealists, especially the female surrealists, and their interest in abstraction, like abstract ideas. I'm thinking like Leonora Carrington. Obviously, there's a lot of difference, but I do see like the way they use bodies and this like archetypal figure and like the drawing, especially Leonora Carrington drawing on medieval and occult ideas. She was British. She lived in Mexico, but she was British. So I think she obviously knew who the Pre-Raphaelites were. I have nothing to back that up, but I definitely see parallels between her art and the later sort of like symbolic Pre-Raphaelitism. I would also say maybe like, it's not really a movement, but like the 80s feminist art.
Yeah.
Not just because of like the Pre-Raphaelite Sisterhood, but because they were making space for, the lesser arts, the crafts. Okay. I mean, again, Judy Chicago is like the obvious choice, but
sure.
I think there are a lot of artists who were recentering and not just recentering, but reintegrating textile and embroidery, and the pottery. Yeah, pottery. And just like the multi-modalities and the intertextual stuff that was going on. I think people were inspired by the Pre-Raphaelites, even if they didn't know it, I think. We can look at like outside of just fine art, like the wave of like fashion and artists in the last 2 decades. I think there was a big like Victorian, medievalist, neoclassical-esque revival that happened. Like Florence and the Machine is like the first one that comes to mind.
Very true.
But also like Gucci, at least with Alessandro Michele, but also just like that sort of like patterned floral fashion that happened in the last like 10 years.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen a lot of cottagecore inspiration traced back to the basic imagery, the basic idea of imagery, symbols and all that came out of Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood artworks.
Yeah.
So
that like the returning to nature, like reverting to like a pre-industrial way of life.
Well, and even the like longer flowy dresses, the unbound curlyish hair, the like laying in grass or a pond and staring up at the sky. Like, you know what I mean? There's
and
a
like
lot of idealization of that sort of I think a lot of people see it as romantic and they idealize that perceived romanticism.
Yeah, the idea of romance, like, encapsulated. Also, the trend with, like, blush recently with the bright red cheeks. Every time I see it, I'm like, that's just a Rossetti painting.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, honeys. So that was our episode for today. I hope you enjoyed our very first guest special episode. Thank you again to my good friend Jacob for joining us and sharing all of his knowledge and anecdotes. Hope you enjoyed learning not only about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but the sisterhood involved with them as well. And we'll talk to you again very soon with our brand new upcoming spooky special. Take care of yourselves, hydrate or dihydrate, and I hope you enjoy your last week before Halloween. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnote. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.